Members, the ayes are 64, the noes are 57. Clause 3 will stand part. I will report this bill with amendment presently. Members, we now move to consideration of the Social Security, Youth Support and Work Focus Amendment Bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part. This is debate on clauses 4 to 21 and Schedule 1.
Mr. Speaker,
Call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my privilege to rise and begin the discussion in committee stages around Part 1 of the Social Security, Youth Support and Work Focus Amendment Bill. And I want to begin at the very beginning of Part 1, which of course sets out that the substantive provisions in this part of the bill will take effect on the 30th of July. I understand that the Minister has tabled a supplementary order paper which would move the enactment date for these provisions till later in August. And I would ask the Minister if she were willing, she referenced it in question time, the reasons for shifting the enactment date for these provisions, but I would be interested in hearing in greater detail the reasons why the enactment of these provisions has been shifted. I of course have heard anecdotally the reasons. I understand there are contract negotiations still underway, that there are issues with information sharing that still haven't been resolved, that not all of those who will be affected by these changes have yet been contacted. So my understanding is that there are considerable issues, not least the fact that some services are of course in a state of limbo while this piece of legislation is still before Parliament. So I would be interested in the Minister commenting on the state of play, as it were, for those youth services and the preparation she's doing for what are substantive changes to the way these services are offered to our young people. And I do want to spend a bit of time, Mr. Chair, over the course of this debate, breaking down some of those changes and debating them further. I think it's important, though, before we start, to at least have some frame, some understanding, and I'd be happy to share, of where the Labour Party has come from in analysing the changes put before them by the government. Now, the government has framed these welfare reforms as being the most substantive in decades. Now, our contention has been that for young people, these are significant changes. Their interface with work and income will change dramatically, but for a very particular group of young people, and we will come back to the question of the breadth of these reforms. But for the majority of people who are on some form of government support, this bill primarily introduces for them work testing, and that beyond that, that there are very few additional provisions in this bill that will assist them into work. And so what we've been calling for throughout this debate is first a look at the availability of work. We know that those on the unemployment benefit have roughly moved since 2008 from 18,000 to just under 50,000. The availability of affordable quality childcare, and of course questions of training and education. So that's the lens with which Labour has looked at these reforms. Now, coming specifically to the provisions of Part 1, the youth services that are being introduced here are proposed to replace the status quo, and the status quo being, of course, a series of youth transition services. We acknowledge that they were ad hoc in terms of their provision across the country. They cost basically $12 million a year to run. That money has been picked up and dropped into the pot for the new youth services. Those youth transition services dealt with a range of ages. Anything from a school leaver, could be as early as 15 if they had an exemption, right up to the age of 20. In fact, many youth transition services have told Labour members that up to 60% of the young people they deal with were outside of the age of 16 and 17. The referrals they got, we acknowledge, was ad hoc. They weren't always getting information from schools about school leavers. We acknowledge that was something that needed to be addressed. They did sometimes, in some cases, have ad hoc arrangements with schools which worked well, but otherwise they were taking referrals and walk-ins. So again, there was certainly room for improvement there, and that we acknowledge. But our question is, have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater with the replacement youth services, which this Part 1 will bring in? And I think the reason that we want to ask that question in Part 1, which is the substantive part that addresses the new youth services framework, is first the question of, have we narrowed the scope of young people we're working with down too far? So the youth services make no apologies for the fact, make no apologies for the fact that they are targeting what the Minister has flagged as being roughly 14,000 16 and 17-year-olds. And we're not denying that they are very much in a pool of young people that do need targeted interventions and services. But they are a subset of a much wider pool. And our concern is that, given the experience of the service providers in this area who have told us that in some cases a school leaver may move in to work straight after school, may move into some kind of training, but may find that after a year or even 6 months that plan that they had has not worked out, and suddenly they don't have the support of school, they don't have the support of other services around them, and then where do they go? Now, if they tip past their 17th birthday, now the youth services are not going to be there specifically for their needs. So our concern is first off whether the eligibility criteria has been narrowed too far for the purposes of this bill. And our second concern with the youth services is essentially the way that they are structured. Now, the funding regime for youth services under this model, under Part 1, has changed dramatically. No longer do we have a contracted service that's picking up all the young people in a region. We now literally have a price on the head of particular young people who are identified centrally as being vulnerable and then dispatched down to a regional level by the local, which sometimes might not be too local, youth service to pick up. And the price on the head of that young person essentially increases depending on their vulnerability, and also depending on what pathway the youth service tries to nudge them down. If they try and get them heading towards NCA level 2, they'll get a bit of bonus payment than they might for some other option for that young person. And I guess our concerns there are quite specific ones. We've heard from youth transition services that often they're dealing with some young people who haven't even achieved NCEA level 1. And that, in fact, it may end up us having a situation where they have a disincentive to work with that most vulnerable young person, because the likelihood of them achieving NCA level 2, of that service receiving their bonus payment, and all of that happening before they hit their 17th birthday is considerably reduced. So therefore, are we creating a rod for our back here where the most vulnerable young people simply become too expensive of a gamble for those youth services to take? And that is not, I'm sure, a scenario that the Minister would wish to encourage. Another issue that we have is we've seen small services have essentially been priced out. Now, a good example of this has been, you know, the much heralded Otrahonga example. I understand that continues with funding at the discretion of MSD rather than under this contract model, because literally they've been so successful that those young people that might be flagged as attracting payments for the service just don't exist to the scale required to maintain a service in that area. And yet it has been such a successful service. So in our minds, that points to a model that is not necessarily fit for purpose for smaller communities and larger communities and everything in between. We're also concerned that we're not necessarily, via this model and the incentive-based payment system, taking into account the individual and best needs and interests of that young person and the circumstances in which they find themselves when they walk through the door of the youth service. Now, that was discretion which youth transition services previously held and I think managed very, very responsibly. Now, we have a supplementary order paper on the table, which essentially says let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater by opting for a very expensive alternative regime when we had the bones of a successful, much more universal system which we could have tweaked and improved upon. And the way we would have improved it was A, by extending it, making sure it was nationwide, B, making sure that information sharing between schools and those youth transition services were mandated, and C, really building on the good work that the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs had already done on trying to improve the youth transition service model, acknowledging where there were some gaps in that service provision. And I have to say, all of that came at a cost much cheaper than what we're seeing for this particular set of provisions, acknowledging, of course, that the Minister has overlaid incentive payments for young people. Putting that aside, I still believe the alternative extension of a youth transition service model was a much more fiscally prudent option than the one that we see before us today. So I asked the Minister, and if she can in her call, respond to the question around the timing, perhaps explain to us her position on why she opted not to address the youth transition service hold.
The Honourable Paula Bennett.
Mr Chairman, there is no